Hey everyone, Midits here. In this video, I'll continue talking about the Diary of Wimpy Kid franchise. If you've not seen the first part of this series, I recommend you watch that first and come back. If you've already seen it or just came back, let's get right into this. Today, we will be talking about the next 4 books in the Wimpy Kid series. These will be books 5 through 8. We will also, just like in the previous video, take breaks between some books to talk about other Wimpy Kid related content. Now, I don't want to spend too much time in this intro, so let's talk about the first book, Diary of a Wimpy Kid, The Ugly Truth. First of all, let's start with the characters. I forgot to mention this character during the last straw, but to be honest, his first proper appearance is in this book, and that is Uncle Gary. Uncle Gary is Frank's younger brother and is shown as being very carefree and lazy, not being able to hold a job for a long time. He's also shown as having been married multiple times, with each marriage not working out because he rushed into the marriage too fast. Besides Uncle Gary being introduced, the only other thing here to talk about is about characters that leave the series in this book. The only characters who make their final appearance here are the Sneelas, but I feel that would be more appropriate that I talk about them later on. So that's all for the character segment, so now let me give the plot summary. This book follows Greg in a new year in middle school. The difference is, though, that Rowley is still not friends with him after the events of Dog Days, so now Greg has to go through middle school with no one by his side while also having to deal with the fact that he started to grow up. The thing is, though, is that Greg wants to grow up. Another major thing in this book is that Uncle Gary is going to have a wedding, so Greg has to go. And at Uncle Gary's wedding, we see the most of Frank's side of the family that we ever see in all of the books. At the wedding, after getting a talk from his great grandmother, Greg realizes that maybe he should enjoy the time he has left being a kid and that he doesn't have to keep waiting to grow up. Greg then decides to start talking with Rel again, and they return to being friends. That's the main plot, so now I just want to get my opinions on this book. While I'll say it is the weakest so far, that's only because I feel like the first 4 Wimpy Kid books are on a whole different level compared to the rest of the series. This book still is really good, and I love the fact that it starts to tackle the idea that Greg is growing up. And now, the ending to some people isn't the best, and it's because people think that the Riley and Greg storyline was finished way too quickly at the end. But in my opinion, it works with the book. Greg decided that he didn't want to begin growing up so fast yet, so he decided to be friends with Rowley again instead of moving on. And Greg himself even says in the book that there's no point ending their friendship over what happened in the summer, to the point that Greg doesn't even remember what they're fighting about. So while it isn't a perfect ending, I still say it works with the message of the book. And now it's time for the segment where I talk about major parts of the story and just general things I noticed while reading. This first part's pretty obvious, but it does connect to Dog Days with the fact that the storyline with Greg and Riley no longer being friends continues into this and is a major part of the book. I also want to talk about Greg's friends besides Rowley, because honestly, Greg's life is kind of sad because from the looks of it, he barely has any friends besides Rowley. The only other really good friends Greg has besides Rowley, and I wouldn't even really say they're that great considering the fact that they're rarely mentioned again after this book, and those are Christopher Brownfield and Tyson Sanders. But because of Greg, they can't be his best friend to replace Rowley, because Greg, being himself, finds issues with them that make him not want either of them as his replacement for Rowley. This next part is a small story that happens in the book where Frank gets really tired of waking up Greg in the morning, so he makes Greg have to wake up on his own. So what Greg does is that he gets a really loud alarm clock and has it so that wakes him up in the morning. But the thing is that with the clocks ticking, he's unable to fall asleep. So when he goes to school the next day, he's super tired, and what ends up happening is that he slips and accidentally turns on the fire alarm. And obviously that turns into a big issue, but the thing is, no one knows who actually set the fire alarm off. But then, of course, with this being middle school, people spread a rumor that the fire alarms would squirt an invisible liquid, which would be on your hand if you pulled the handle. And people were saying that teachers were waiting for students to go use the bathroom to see if they were the people that pulled the handle. So this ends with nobody in the entire school using the bathroom, and things got so bad to the point that they had to cancel school early. And this just goes to show that even when Greg does try, another major factor when it comes to Greg is the fact that he is just really unlucky. Because honestly, what were the odds that in the one moment where he fell asleep, he landed on the fire alarm? The next thing I want to talk about is something I mentioned earlier on, and that's how this is the Sneela's final appearance in the books. And in the previous books, when I mentioned characters leaving the series, I'd never explained why. And that's because, really, there isn't an explanation given. It's just they don't appear in future books. But the difference here is that the Snealers are actually given an explanation as to why they leave the series. This all happened during one of the Snealers' half birthday parties, which I mentioned back in the last straw. During this party, Greg got a bunch of deviled eggs, because he remembered eating them at his grandma's house, but when he ate the ones at the Snealers' house, he absolutely hated them. So what he decided to do was that instead of throwing away like any sensible person, he would throw them away in a plastic plant in the Snealers' house. And later on, the eggs obviously start to smell really bad, so the Snealers start looking around their entire house to see if they could find what was causing the smell. And eventually, things just got so bad to the point that the Snealers just moved. And not only that, but they took the plastic plant with them. And of course, Greg, after pretty much just ruining this family's life, immediately wonders how he can get deviled eggs into Fregley's house. So yeah, if you somehow haven't caught on yet, Greg isn't the best person. This is another big storyline in the books, and it involves how Susan sees how everything in the house is a mess with her gone, so she decides to get the family a maid. But what ends up happening is that Susan wants the Heffleys to clean the house so that their maid Isabella doesn't think they live in a pigsty. So that when their maid arrives, she does no work because everything's done, and when Susan comes back, she thinks the maid did a great job keeping the house clean. When obviously, it was the family that did everything. And their maid just gets away with doing absolutely nothing. And it just keeps on going until one day when Susan finds their maid holding a huge watch-along party at their house. And that's where that story ends off. And the last thing I want to talk about happens at the end of the story, where Greg and Riley become friends again. We see Riley give Greg a friendship locket that says best friends. But what's notable about it is that this locket also appears in some other point of the series, but it's not in the main books. It's actually in a spin-off we're going to be talking about very soon. And now, that's all there is to mention about The Ugly Truth, and I'm going to be doing something a bit different here. Instead of having a break after the first book like in the first video, I'm going to have the break now. Because I feel that it's just better to have a break before the final book instead of having it after. So our first break, we'll be talking about none other than the Wimpy Kid Do-It-Yourself book. The Wimpy Kid Do-It-Yourself book is a Wimpy Kid themed activity book that gives you tons of different things to do, such as questions, drawings, and various things you get to talk about yourself. The Do-It-Yourself book is filled with many references to the Wimpy Kid universe, and even references some stuff outside of Wimpy Kid. For example, some comics shown in the book originate from Igdoof, such as Ugly Eugene and other comics shown. And in the end, there is a segment where you can write whatever you want, including your very own journal. Now, I don't want to spend too much time here on the break, but there are just two things here I want to talk about. The first thing is the fact that this is the first time we see Greg's family tree, although it is a very simplified version of it, only containing parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents. One thing I love here is the fact that Mima and Peepaw, Greg's great-grandparents from Susan's side of the family, appear here, and they have the exact same design that they do when they later on appear in the books. It just goes to show how Jeff Kinney enjoys calling back to previous things in the books. The second thing I want to mention is that we actually see a prototype version of something we'll be talking about a lot later on in the future. That being Diary of an Awesome Friendly Kid. Diary of an Awesome Friendly Kid is a Wimpy Kid spinoff that happens later on in the series and is told from Roger's perspective. But what I find really cool is that Diary of an Awesome Friendly Kid originated from the Do-It-Yourself book as one of the comics near the end of the book. And honestly, it's so neat that Jeff Kinney decided to bring back some random comic made for a spin-off from a decade ago and turn into a full book. That's all I want to talk about regarding the Do-It-Yourself book, so let's move on now to the next book, Diary of a Wimpy Kid, Cabin Fever. Firstly, let's talk about characters leaving the series, because at this point, that's the only thing that's actually happening. This is the final appearance of not only Uncle Charlie, who's been appearing consistently throughout the whole series to this point, but it is also the final appearance of Chirag. And man, it's just such a shame that we just keep losing characters left and right. But there's nothing we can really do about it, so let's just move on to the main plot summary. Cabin Fever follows Greg trying to act his best so that he can get good presents for Christmas. Later on in the story, Greg and Rowley hold a bazaar at their house and, when they try to advertise the event, they end up accidentally defacing school property. Now, Greg is super worried about being arrested by the police, except the Heffleys are now trapped inside their house since there's a giant snowstorm going on. In the end, it is revealed that, for a decent amount of time, The snowstorm was over, and Manny turned off all the electricity in the house except for his room. And he then took everything in the house for himself. And then a little bit later on, Greg is relieved to find out that he won't be arrested, and when looking for a potential gift he requested, he ends up clearing the way for a soup kitchen that was going to be closed, becoming a hero with no one knowing that it was him who did it. That's the basic story, and now I just want to talk about this book. My opinion on this book is that it's great, and it's probably in the top 5 Wimpy Kid books. Greg here is at his least mean version, and while some people could see that as mischaracterization, it actually makes sense that Greg is acting nice since he's trying to get better gifts on Christmas. I also love how in this book, there feels like there are proper stakes. In most of the books, we see relationship issues we can probably guess will inevitably be solved, but in this book, Greg feels like he's actually at risk of being in serious trouble, and that's something that doesn't really happen again in the series. So yeah, this book is awesome. Now let's talk about some things I noticed while reading. The first thing I want to talk about is something that happens earlier on in the book, where Greg's talking about bullying, and he was talking about how him and Rowley got bullied by some kid on the way to school. And Greg told Frank about it, and what ended up happening is that Frank and Mr. Jefferson went to go to the kid's house to talk to his parents. But what they end up finding out is that the kid that was bullying Greg and Rowley was only 5 years old. So, Greg doesn't earn the title of being the wimpy kid by doing nothing. This is another thing that's mentioned, and that's the fact that Greg really hates when Rowley skips. And Rowley says that Greg is just jealous because he doesn't know how to skip, which is actually true. Not only that, but Greg says he was the only kid in his entire grade who couldn't do it. The next thing I want to talk about is a pretty recurring thing in this book, and it's Alfredo. Alfredo is this toy doll that Greg gets around the time Manny's about to be born because Susan wants Greg to practice being an older brother. And Greg takes really good care of the doll, but what ends up happening is that it just disappears out of nowhere. And so Greg really freaks out. And so he gets a grapefruit to replace Alfredo. He ends up actually getting attached to that also, but then obviously it starts rotting and Greg finally gets caught. But the thing is, Greg still is worried that one day Alfredo will show up again. And he does show up again later on in the book when Greg finds him hidden in the basement. And Greg guesses that most likely Frank just hid Alfredo from him because Frank wasn't really excited about the idea. This is another thing that's a recurring story across the book, and that's how Greg keeps playing this game called Net Critters. You've probably heard of games similar like this, where you own a pet and you buy different items for it so that it can be happy. And Greg spends a lot of time playing this game. And it eventually culminates with Manny playing the game when Greg's not at home, and he ends up selling everything, spending it all at a casino, and then changing the password so Greg can't play it again. If I haven't been giving enough examples of why Manny's the worst, there's just one of them, out of many. This part is a minor storyline that happens in the book, where Greg didn't feel well during PE, so Greg told his coach that he would do his sit-ups at home for homework. But obviously, his coach wants proof that he did it. And so what Greg does is the next day, he uses mascara to draw a six-pack on him. And somehow that works. To be honest, Greg says that it works, but I'm pretty sure at that point, the gym teacher just didn't really care enough to say anything. And not only that, but a bunch of other kids start doing it too. And then they get fully caught once they start running and the mascara wears out. Here's another small thing that happens in the book. Greg is a big fan of this comic series, Tower of Druids. And Greg talks about how Susan got him an autograph from the author of the books. But then when Greg goes to sell it so he can afford Christmas presents for everyone, he finds out that it was a forgery. And of course he realizes that Susan forged the autograph so that they would stop waiting in line. And Greg immediately realizes this because he mentioned earlier on in the book how Susan just hates waiting in line. Now, I want to talk about a bigger part of the story, and it's pretty much one of the biggest parts of it. And this is where Greg talks about this holiday bazaar his school is holding, and how there they sell chicken wings called drummies. And Greg talks about how good they are. And what Greg ends up finding out is that they're available at the grocery store for way cheaper. And so Greg decides to hold his own bazaar to compete with the school. And they also create a newspaper to publish it called The Tattler to try and advertise it. But what ends up happening is that they create signs to also advertise their event. And what ends up happening is that it starts raining, so the signs get ruined. And once they take them off, they realize there are giant splotches on one of the walls of the school where the signs used to be. And as they try to clean them off, someone sees them and they just run away. And that's what causes Greg to believe that he's going to get in big trouble. Because when he wakes up and sees the newspaper, it talks about two kids who vandalized the school. And now this next part is going to be a continuation of this storyline. What ends up happening is that Rowley reveals that him and Greg vandalized the school. But the thing is that Rowley says it as quote unquote, me and Greg Heffley vandalized the school. And of course, Greg just immediately knows that Riley did that because he's not the brightest sometimes. and I guess Raleigh just thought they would immediately know that he put it in there. What ends up happening is that Greg is told that he can take the punishment for himself, or he could name the person who helped him, which would obviously be Rowley. And then here comes probably my favorite moment in the whole book, where Greg talks about how he really wants to get back at Rowley for writing his name on the paper, but he also doesn't see why Rowley should get in trouble for something he was mainly responsible for. And what ends up happening is that the book has one of the greatest callbacks in the entire series back to the first book, where Greg says he'll take one for the team, which is the exact same thing he said when he let Rowley take the blame for what he did in the first book. And man, I just absolutely love that callback because it really makes these first few books feel really connected. And so what ends up happening is that Greg's the only one who gets in trouble, and then when he gets home, he sees a letter from the police saying that they came by. So of course Greg starts freaking out thinking that he's going to get arrested. But later on, we find out that's not the case. This is another small thing I want to mention. It's not really that big of a thing, but it's actually mentioned later on in the series, and that's the fact that Greg knows that they're going to be stuck in the snow for a really long time because the snowplow comes to their place very late since it constantly gets ambushed. And I'm pretty sure that actually is going to be referenced again in a future book. So it's important to note that. And now, there are two more things I want to talk about, and it mainly has to do with the end of the story. And that's first of all the fact that Manny leaves everyone to die. Like I mentioned before, Manny turned off the electricity in the entire house except for his room, and then took anything he could get his hands on, like I mentioned before. And what Manny says when he gets figured out is that the reason he did everything was because no one taught him how to tie his shoes. And what's probably the funniest part is that at the very end of the book, Susan teaches Manny how to tie his shoes, but Manny still has Susan do it for him anyway. So yeah, I'd say this is probably the biggest book for Manny, since this is the one that just shows him as absolutely evil. Not just like annoying or anything, but he literally just leaves his whole family to die. There's no going around it. That just happens. And now this is the very last thing I want to talk about, which also happens near the end of the book. What ends up happening is that Greg needs to leave a toy at the toy drive, which is by the police station. So Greg does that, and what he remembers is that he filled out a request for a gift at his church, but he was really specific with it. So Greg said to hide it under a recycling bin behind the church. And so Greg is unable to find it because of all the snow. So what ends up happening is that he clears all of it out, and then he sees there's nothing there. He goes back home. This is the point in the book where he finds out he won't be arrested. And then Greg finds out in the newspaper the next day that he unknowingly cleared the entrance to the soup kitchen, meaning that a lot of people who weren't going to be able to get food on Christmas were now able to. And it was all thanks to Greg. And of course, what Greg immediately thinks of is how he's going to get famous off of it. Because even though Greg is a lot better in this book, he's obviously still Greg. And as much as you can make him nicer, you can't really change who he is. Now, that's all I want to talk about, so let's head on to the next book, Diary of a Wimpy Kid, The Third Wheel. First, let's begin by talking about the characters. There's only one character to note here, and that's the introduction of Abigail into the series. She only appears in this book and the next, but she plays a very prominent role. We're going to be talking about her more later on, though. Now, when it comes to the story, this book follows Greg going through middle school as usual, but then suddenly, everything is turned upside down as there is now going to be a Valentine's Day dance at school. This causes Greg to start trying to find a girl to go to the dance with him. And also, I should probably note this here. Uncle Gary starts living with the Heffley family, and it's only for this book. He tries to give Greg advice, and when Greg goes to the dance, Uncle Gary's the DJ there. Anyway, let's get back to the summary. Nothing works, except Greg is able to go to the dance with Abigail as friends along with Rowley. But before they head out, Greg realizes that Rowley has chickenpox, since there's a recent outbreak at school. Greg and Rowley are super worried about this, but Greg just has Rowley hide it, because if Rowley doesn't go to the dance, Greg doesn't either. But here's the thing, I should mention this, it's not chickenpox, it's just pimples. And now tons of things happen across the night, which causes the quote-unquote date to continue declining in quality. And by the end, Greg actually gets a chance to dance with Abigail. But while dancing, Greg sees what he believes to be chickenpox on Abigail, and he just freaks out in front of everyone at the dance. This causes Abigail to be super upset, and by then, the dance is over. And as Greg is home, having, ironically enough, actually gotten the chickenpox, he finds out that Rowley and Abigail are apparently now a couple, and that's how the story ends. I think that this is the weakest book of the first 8. Not that it's terrible or anything, but it's just that it feels like there's more to all the other books compared to this one. One common complaint I've seen is that Greg feels out of character in this book with how he keeps trying to find other girls to go to the dance with him. But Greg has really always been like this. We had a whole book where Greg tried to get Holly to even notice him, so it's not really out of character what happens in this book. And while I did say this is the worst of the original eight, there's still a lot of things in this book that I really like. That's all I got for my opinions, so let's see what small things I should mention. Firstly, I want to talk about something which happens at the beginning of the book, and it shows one major thing you need to know about the series, and that's the fact that Greg is a ginormous liar. At the beginning of the book, Greg mentions how he has really good memory and that he remembers all the way back to when he was born. And he says not only that, but he remembers what life was like before he was born. That is impossible. You can't have memory like that. Greg is obviously lying. And that once again just goes to show how you really can't trust Greg with everything that he says in the series because you don't know what he's changing to make himself look better. Here's another small thing that's mentioned in the beginning when Greg's talking about his childhood, and that has to do with how he talks about how he was really behind as a kid. And so what he did was that he tried to make the other kids go down to his level by lying to them about things in school. And what ends up happening is that Susan thinks that Greg is being challenged enough, so she sends him from preschool into kindergarten, which obviously Greg could just not handle, and so Greg ends up going back to preschool. So that means that Greg has canonically dropped out of kindergarten. Another thing we learn about in this book, but isn't brought again in the series, is the fact that Manny has a lot of imaginary friends. There's even a list given in the book. There's Joey, Petey, Danny, Charles Tribble, the other Charles Tribble, Tiny Jim, and Johnny Cheddar. And those imaginary friends are very real to Manny. Like, for example, there was one time where he freaked out because they left one of his imaginary friends at the grocery store. And there was also one time where Manny broke a plate and he blamed it on one of his imaginary friends. And Greg thinks that Manny's just doing it because he can get a bunch of free stuff when having imaginary friends. And honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if that's what's happening. Another thing I want to talk about is this location, which we see quite a bit in this book, which is called Corny's. It's this restaurant that Greg goes to with his family, and it's this country-like fast food place, which is a ginormous mess. And the most important thing about Corny's is the fact that when Greg, Raleigh, and Abigail are going to go to the dance, they actually go to Corny's first and eat there. And by this point, things were already going downhill because they weren't even supposed to go to Corny's in the first place. And Greg tried to convince them not to go, but Greg lost the argument with them. Another small thing in here is when Uncle Gary moves in with them, he talks about the reason he ran out of money, and that's the fact that he bought shirts from a guy who was selling Boston shirts. And also, I made a whole video talking about where Diary of a Wimpy Kid takes place, and this is one of the main reasons I gave that it takes place in Massachusetts. Because obviously, no one's going to want a Boston shirt in any other state. But anyway, let me stop getting sidetracked. What ends up happening is that the shirts don't say Boston, they say Botson. And so Uncle Gary obviously can't sell those and he gets scammed. What ends up happening later on is that when Uncle Gary is the DJ at the dance, he starts selling those shirts because the lights are off at the dance and nobody can actually see what the shirts say. That is until they have to turn off the lights at the dance and Uncle Gary gets found out. And this is something all the way back from Roderick Rules and The Last Straw I was talking about, and it's the fact that this is the first Valentine's Day dance the school has had, even though this is not the first Valentine's Day dance the school has had. We saw in the third book that there was a Valentine's Day dance, but in this book, they just completely ignore it like it didn't happen. And while there are obviously a lot of moments where the continuity in the Wimpy Kid books kind of falter because they'll mention stuff that didn't happen, this is a really bad case of it because it mentions something that didn't happen but actually did in the previous book. And I can't really think of any bigger continuity errors than this one. This is also another storyline across this book, and it's directly caused by the Valentine's Day dance. What happens is that all the guys try to get a girl to go to the dance with them, and so they start acting on their best behavior. But the only time where girls are around is PE. And what starts happening is that they start messing around PE more than they normally do, and someone ends up pantsing another person. And then that person who got pantses them back, and then it just turns into complete pandemonium. And it gets to the point where the vice principal starts telling them about how big of a problem pantsing is when he ends up getting pantsed himself. And they don't catch the kid who did it. And so that kid is given the name the Mad Pantster. And now Greg mentions how the Mad Pantster is most likely one of four kids, because there had been many pantsing incidents recently, and four kids were out of school due to chickenpox. And now, there are a couple people who made videos trying to figure out of those four people who the Mad Pantster is, but I actually want to propose a theory. I don't think any of those four kids shown were the Mad Pantster, because what happens later on is that Rowley gets pantsed during the dance, and when we see the Mad Pantster, it's very clear that he does not have chickenpox. So, it could be possible that he was just already feeling better, or it could be a completely different person. Even then, we have just no idea who it is. And the last thing I want to mention is that this is another instance where this book leads directly into the next book. But I'll say this is 100% the biggest case of it. Like, even bigger than Dog Days to Ugly Truth, because Hard Luck doesn't feel like the book after the third wheel. It is 100% a sequel to the third wheel, even more than The Ugly Truth compared to Dog Days. That is everything I got for the third wheel, so let's talk about possibly my favorite intermission yet, the original Diary of a Wimpy Kid film trilogy. From 2010 to 2012, there were 3 films made adapting the first 4 Diary of a Wimpy Kid books. These movies followed Greg from his first year of middle school to the summer before his last year. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail with this story, because 1, the plots are very similar to the books, although there are a few sizable changes, and 2, talking about the first 3 Wimpy Kid movies could honestly be worthy of its own video. I'll just say that this is possibly one of the best parts of the whole Wimpy Kid franchise. The feeling this movie gives is so nostalgic, not for the films themselves, but for the time when you were a kid and had the time to do whatever you want. Also, this is the greatest casting job done in any movie ever. Every single actor in these films does a great job, from Zachary Gordon as Greg, Devin Bostic as Roderick, Robert Capron as Rowley, Steve Zahn as Frank, and just the whole cast. They do an excellent job. I also love how a lot of characters who were mentioned in just a couple pages of the book are given way more character in the movies. Even major characters feel like they have way more important roles in the films. And I just want to end it off by saying that the best thing about these movies is the fact that the world it sets up is mostly very consistent. Unlike the books where, as we've seen, characters will be introduced, shown a couple times, and never appear again in the rest of the series. Honestly, I felt sad at some points watching these movies because I already know what is going to begin happening in the books, and I know it's just about to begin. I also recommend you read the Wimpy Kid movie diary for the first 3 books, since it gives a lot of information on the production of the movies, and it is just a really entertaining read. Anyway, let's move on to the final book of the video, Diary of a Wimpy Kid, Hard Luck. Characters who are never appearing in the series again after this book, Bryce Anderson and Abigail. There are practically no consistent supporting characters at Greg's school after this point, and we are really going to feel that later on. Now, the main story goes like this. Rowley is rarely hanging out with Greg anymore now that he's with Abigail, and the rest of the book follows Greg trying to make it through middle school without Rowley, similar to The Ugly Truth. But in this case, you can really feel that Greg is unable to work properly without Rowley. And now, right when spring break rolls around, Susan surprises everyone by saying that her family will be visiting for Easter. So, once again, similar to The Ugly Truth, we'll be seeing a side of Greg's family, this time being Susan's. The thing that's different, though, is that the last time the family was together, everyone was at each other's throats at the funeral of Greg's great-grandmother, Meemaw. You see, Meemaw had a wedding ring, which was worth a lot, and when she died, no one could find where the ring went. This caused the family to start arguing with each other, and that's why they hadn't had a family gathering ever since. So now Greg has that to look forward to. Later on, after making a lot of really bad decisions on his own, Greg finds a magic 8 ball in Roderick's room and decides to begin using it to make decisions for him. This culminates in Greg getting caught cheating on a test and discovering that he is very close to getting to summer school. Greg throws the ball to Grandma's backyard, viewing it worthless since it broke when he dropped it. Greg is able to get the project done with the help of Susan and starts feeling better. He then finds out that Abigail dumped Rowley and only dated him so that her ex-boyfriend would be jealous. Greg wonders what he should do regarding Rowley and goes back to the magic 8 ball. He then discovers an Easter egg for one of Meemaw's Easter egg hunts that contains her wedding ring. Greg thinks about how much money he could make selling it, but he realizes it's not worth destroying the family and hides the egg. Greg then decides to talk with Rowley again, and they return to being friends. And now that's the basic plot of this book. And I just want to say that even if this book doesn't compare to the first 4, this is easily one of my personal favorites in the series. I feel like this is a great send-off to the classic Wimpy Kid era, especially since a few characters have their last appearances here, and there are even more characters who are very likely supposed to have their final appearances here also, as well as the fact that there are tons of references and callbacks to the rest of the series. Lastly, this feels like the final Wimpy Kid book, which has the characters as the main focus. This is, at its core, a story about 2 best friends who begin growing apart, but because they both need each other, they come back together. And you can probably tell how much I love this book with how long I've been talking about it. Speaking about talking about it very long, let's now move on to the final things I noticed segment. The first thing I want to mention is something which I talked about before in the previous part, and that's the fact that this is the final book which aspects from the online version can be found in, with one exception being Diary of an Awesome Friendly Kid. There are a couple things in there that contains stuff from the online version, but from the mainline series, this is it. Everything else is original content. And now, this is a group of characters that are introduced in this book called the Mingos. They're a bunch of kids that live in the woods that nobody really knows the story behind them, and they're occasionally shown as antagonists in this book, and it's important to mention them here since they are going to be returning in a future book. One thing I actually made a video about a while back was how there are Easter eggs in this book, and I mean there are a lot of Easter eggs in this book. If you go too hard luck and you look through the pages, you can occasionally see just Easter eggs hidden around, and I mean actual Easter eggs, by the way. And according to the Diary of Wimpy Wiki, there are a total of 104 Easter eggs in this book. In fact, there was actually a challenge where you had to guess how many Easter eggs you could find in this book around the time the book came out. So if you're ever reading the book, you should definitely try looking for those. There's another thing here where we kind of get a sort of conclusion to one story, which has to do with Greg and phones, and how throughout the entire Wimpy Kid series, Greg is just unable to get a phone because his parents don't view him as responsible enough for one. And obviously, we see Greg with the Ladybug phone that he gets in Dog Days. But what ends up happening is that Greg uses reverse psychology, saying that he's not responsible enough for a phone, and they end up giving him one, since the reverse psychology worked. But what ends up happening is that Greg uses the phone, he gets a face call while using the toilet, and drops it in the toilet. So that just goes to show Greg was probably right there. He's not responsible enough for a phone. This is another major storyline that happens later on in the book, and it follows how Greg joins the yearbook committee. And Greg is a photographer, so he takes a bunch of candidates for the yearbook, and he also edits them to mess around a lot, especially with people he doesn't like. And what ends up happening later on is that we actually get another callback to the first book with the class favorites, which was kind of a thing I forgot to mention in the first book since it wasn't a really major thing. But one of Greg's motivations in the book becomes getting in the class favorites list, where you'll get your own section where you're mentioned in the yearbook. And at the end of the first book, we see that Rowley won class clown. Now it's brought back here, and we see that Greg has to take photos for class favorites. And Greg talks about how the majority of the winners are people you'd expect, and there's quite a couple callbacks to different characters across the books. Although one thing that is funny is the fact that someone on the yearbook staff messed with the results so that they would get best looking. And there's a couple other things I want to mention about this. And the first thing I want to talk about is the fact that Fregley actually won most popular. Because during one point in the book, Greg became friends with Fregley to try and fill the void without Rowley. And he ended up accidentally making Fregley super popular. And what ended up happening is that the very last pictures Greg had to take were of the cutest couple being Rowley and Abigail. So obviously Greg didn't have a lot of fun with that. But there was at least one part of it that Greg enjoyed, because at the end of the book, we see that Greg put in the yearbook the picture of Rowley and Abigail, but he shrunk Rowley's head by like 75%. And now the last thing I want to talk about is Meemaw's wedding ring. Like I mentioned before, Greg finds it in an Easter egg in Grandma's backyard, and so Greg decides that's better to hide it than to sell it and destroy the whole family. And so what Greg ends up doing, because of course this is Greg, he wants to make sure it's in a place he can remember it, so he hides it in his mom's closet. But man, could you imagine if someone else found that? How bad that would look? Because Susan was the only person in the entire family who was not arguing about Meemaw's wedding ring. That would be such a huge mess if it was found out that she was the one hiding it. But unfortunately, the wedding ring is just never mentioned again in the entire series. So, we're most likely not getting a storyline involving that. And now, that's everything I wanted to talk about here, so I just want to give my thoughts on this era of the series. While this era isn't on the same level of the first four books, it's still a great continuation of said era. I really love how the stories in these books make it actually feel like Greg is growing up and developing as a person. He obviously still has his flaws, but there are clearly some changes with Greg from where he began to where he is now. And as long as the series keeps going like this, it's going to just keep being great. But you'll know what I mean in the next part. I'll see you all in the next one.